Hey, what's up, everyone? Welcome to this live stream with a topic that's quite exciting because we're going to discover 30 tips to be a better iOS developer. So, where did I get the idea from this live stream? I got the idea because a few days ago, I think it was at the end of last week, I came across an article that was entitled, as you can imagine, 30 tips to be a better iOS developer. But what caught my attention was the author of this article, because it was someone named Ronnie Faddle, who is a former Apple engineer, who is now an indie app developer, and is actually the developer of the app I use to add subtitles to my videos. So I know the quality of his work, and I figured that must be some pretty great content. So I asked him if it was okay with me covering his content in a live stream. He said yes, and so here we are. So let me switch to Safari. So this is the article. You have the link in the description if you want to go over it by yourself. And the plan is that we're going to go over it during this live stream. We're going to discuss the tips. I'm going to give you my opinion on them. I didn't go over them before. I just glanced over the content, but I'm going to discover at the same time than you are. I will give you my honest opinion on them. And of course, if you are watching live, please also give your opinion in the chat, ask questions, make remarks, try to make it as interactive as possible, especially for the people who will be watching the replay. It will be so much better for them. So let's get started. 30 tips to make you a better iOS developer. As you can see, the article is from a bit more than 3 years ago, so some of the newest possibilities in iOS Xcode just will not be taken into account, but given the quality of the person who wrote it, I think it's still okay that the article is from 3 years ago. So let's go. So Ronnie has compiled a list of depth tips that he feels every iOS developer should know. Ready? Here we go. We'll see how many of them we already knew. So first one is how to quick look an object in Xcode if you only have its address. And by address, I think he means address in memory. So there is a small video. You know what? I'm going to pause it, put it at the beginning, and just first, let's look at the list. So first step is to click on the pause button and choose a non-Swift frame. Okay, so let me zoom in a bit. So you pause the execution of your program. So by clicking on the pause button that you have right here. Okay, then you pick a non-Swift frame. So I think it's in this part right here. So a frame in the sense of a memory frame, not a UIKit frame, that is not a Swift frame in memory. Okay. Then you do right-click, add expression. Okay. You paste in the address and you typecast the object's type. So you can see that, okay, what's important to see is that in the console output, you can see that we have the address of a memory object that seems to be causing trouble. Here, a UI image, but we don't know yet what is inside this image. So it's very hard to know which UI image is actually causing some trouble. So we are on this memory frame that is non-Swift. We add an expression. In the expression, so we typecast the address to a UI image because we do know that it is a UI image. It adds in the frame a typed reference, a typed pointer to the UI image. And then if we do space, we can quick look over it. And so we can see what is the actual UI image that causes issue. And you can expect that once you see which is the image that causes an issue, then it's much easier for you in your code to understand what's happening. So I did not know this tip. However, I did know another one. So I can show you because you have the controls of QuickTime over it, but you can also copy and paste the memory address. You can go in the inspector here and choose to display all the objects in memory. And then you can paste in the filter the address, and you can also get the data that way. Maybe we'll see it a little bit later, but it's also a great tip. And if we don't see it, I will make a mental note to make a social media post about it. And you can see some familiar names and faces in the chat. It's nice to see that I have some company this evening. Okay, second tip, app metadata localization. So for App Store optimization, you can localize your app's name, description, and keywords without having to localize the app itself. So you could have your app be only in English in every country, but you might still want to localize the data that's appearing on the App Store. And so in App Store Connect, you can create a new app version. Then you select the language selector on the right, so this thing here. You enter your localized metadata and you save. So in App Store Connect, you can define localized metadata for your app that will show up in the App Store or that will have an impact on user searches in the App Store, but you don't need to actually localize your app for it. So your app could be only in English, but you could have, for instance, your data, your metadata on App Store Connect be localized into French, into Spanish, into German. So that can be a nice trick. It's more of an indie dev trick, I guess. But if you want to, if you're wondering whether it's worth it to localize your entire app, it might be a great way to just like tip some toes into the water and see like when you localize your App Store metadata for a given country, do you see your downloads increasing? I guess if you do, then that means that it might be worth it. It's a signal that it might be worth it to invest into localizing the entire app itself. So that's pretty smart. I didn't know that one. But also, to be fair, I'm not an indie dev, so I've didn't have to deal with this kind of situation. But it's a very smart tip. Number 3 is how to demangle Swift symbols. So demangling, it means when you see this kind, let me just go back to it and then I will zoom. When you see this kind of, let me put it on pause, okay, put it where I want. Here, when you see this kind of very long string being outputted into the console and you have a feeling that this name, it contains like the name of a package, the name of a type, maybe the name of a method, but it's not super human readable. And so you can demangle it using a tool from the Swift tools, so called Swift Demangle. And so you run it, and as you can see, it's going to give you the demangle version, which here is, so it's Swift UI, so it's part of Swift UI. Then it's a UI hosting view with generic types, which represents all of the modifiers being called on the UI hosting view. So this can be super helpful whenever you have a crash, either during compilation or during execution, even though this is more likely to happen during compilation, and you have this kind of string being outputted and you want to understand what it actually means. I have some memory about this story time because I went in 2019 to WWDC, so the last real 5 days WWDC, and I had to debug an issue like this for a customer, with the customer being with me. And actually, I had the help of one of the Swift compiler engineer called Doug Gregor, who showed me how to demangle the Swift symbol, so that I could better understand the issue I had, which was that my app would segfault when trying to build it using the new beta of Xcode. So it was an interesting time. Number 4, so more of an indie dev hack. So Apple Search Ads credit. Have you an iOS app that you'd like to promote? If you haven't tried Apple Search Ads before, you can get $100 United States dollars in free credits when you first sign up. So same thing, if you want to see if it's worth it to advertise for your app and you don't want to spend money, you actually get $100 in free credit. I didn't know about that. I guess if you have a small app and you want to just like give it a try, see if it's worth not only investing the money but also investing the time and energy, I guess it can be a good way to take the money part out of the equation. Tip number 5, referencing your identifiable objects ID type. So this one seems to be more related to Swift UI, and it seems it's a trick from Donny Valls. So in Swift UI, but actually the protocol identifiable is not part of Swift UI. It's part of the Swift standard library itself, even though Swift UI relies on it a lot. So you have a struct user which is identifiable, and then you want to refer to this ID type, and you can do user.id in order to refer to it instead of the actual type, which makes your code easier to refactor and also the intent clearer. But I would also say that makes it more correct, because here, indeed the ID is an int, but you should not be able to provide any kind of int. The int should originate from something that is meant to be an ID of a user. So doing this user.id, it's a way to add some extra safety to your language. This approach, it's called, maybe not this one, maybe it's a slight variation, but it's very close to the technique which is called using a phantom type to introduce type safety in this kind of situation. I made a video about it at the end of last year. So if you want to see this alternate approach, you can check the video after the live. But this tip is really nice because it doesn't need you to introduce any new concept or new protocol. It's building on, it's leveraging an existing protocol which is already extremely used inside iOS apps, because SwiftUI leverages it a bit. It's what SwiftUI uses in order to tell which element is which in when it displays lists. So this is very useful. And so what you should take away from this is that when you have a type that conforms to identifiable, you should never use the actual type of the ID, but you should always use the type alias, so user.id, which indeed is int, but if you change int, this will be changed automatically, whereas this wouldn't. Okay, moving on to number 6. Using warning instead of to do. This one, I really like it. I think I did a video about that one, maybe I think it was 1 year ago, something like that. I think it was about error, about pound error, but it's the same ID, which is that you can leave, of course, a to-do comment in your code, but you can also use a warning, which will have the added side effect of triggering a warning at compile time. So the idea is that, I would say, if you expect this to-do to stay for a long time, maybe it could be like to-do remove once we drop the next version of iOS. This one, you might want it to be just a regular to-do, but if it's like to-do, we need to do this before we merge the code, then adding a warning is better because it will draw attention to it. Depending on how your project has been set up, it might also make your CI fail, which is guaranteed to draw your attention to it. So I think it's a very good practice. And you also have another one which is called pound error, and this one does the same thing except that it triggers an error. So you're less likely to use it when you are developing. However, if you are writing code that is meant to be integrated into another project and that needs to be set up at some places, like typically you have an SDK and you need to put an API key in the sample code, then using pound error is a great way to direct the attention of your user at the place where they need to make a change, because they will get a compilation error that will redirect them to that place. But warning instead of to do is a very good one. I must say I've almost always used to do like this, but now that I know about it, I might be inclined to try the other way around. And I see some nice comments in the chat. Thank you, Martin. So number 7, asserting on which queue your code is running. So call dispatch precondition in your code base to control on which queues methods and callbacks are executed. For example, to make sure a callback is executed on the main queue, you can, so you have a method that calls back on main, okay? And you can do dispatch precondition on queue main. And so I guess if you call this method and you're not on the main queue, you will get like either a crash or something like that. Let me Google it actually. Let me go on Google. Let me check this, because I've never used this method actually. So iOS 10, check a dispatch condition necessary for further execution. Okay. Use this function to detect conditions about the current execution context that must prevent the program from proceeding even in shipping code, so it's going to crash your app. In playgrounds and -onon builds, if condition evaluates to false, stop program execution in a debuggable state. In -o builds, the default for release condition, if condition evaluates to false, stop program. And in -o unchecked, then it's not evaluated, but the optimizer assumes it will evaluate to true, so you could have big issues. Okay, it's an interesting one. I had never used it before, so it's interesting to see that it's going to assert that you're on the right queue. It will not switch to the right queue by itself. But I guess it might make sense if you want to to trigger a crash in case something wrong happened. I must say I've never used it, mostly because the kind of crash that you get in that kind of situation are when you try to touch a UIKit object from a background thread, and you will get a crash from UIKit. So you get that behavior kind of like built in. I guess it might be a good practice to introduce this, especially if it's very important for the logic of your app that you are running on a specific queue, and that there is nothing else that will trigger a crash. Like if running your code on the wrong queue would produce corrupted data, for instance, then it can be very helpful. One thing to note is that this, I think, makes a lot of sense when using completion handlers. But if you are writing more modern Swift code which uses async await, then I would say you are much better using actors in order to assert on which queue you are, because actors, they are a higher level abstraction that take care of making sure either access is synchronized or that you are running in the correct queue, like when you use the main actor. Okay, tip number 8, save an extra Boolean state variable when using alerts or sheets. So save an extra, so by save, I think it means not using. So saving, save in the English sense. It just seems weird for me because reading it as a French person, I thought like save, but like command S, let's save something, so it felt a bit weird. So save an extra add state property, show alert or show sheet variable in your interview to show alerts, sheets, and models by using an extension on binding. That's an interesting one. So we extend binding and we say presence. It's a function that takes no argument and returns the binding to a Boolean where value, so the value of the binding is an optional of t. And what it's gonna do is that it's gonna create a binding. And so for the getter, it's going to check if the wrap value is different from nil. Otherwise, it's going to set a new value. For the setter, it's going to set a new value. If it's false, there is an error because this should never happen. And when the new value is set, it's going to set the wrap value to nil. So that's a smart one because it kind of uses the wrap value of binding as an optional, and it uses the fact that you can store something. I mean, if it's not nil, okay. What I cannot wrap my head around is what is stored inside the wrap value when it's not nil. I guess it's going to be true. I guess it's going to be no, not even that. I see what they're doing, but I cannot fully wrap my head around it. It's a really interesting one. But the bottom line is that then, at least on the user at the use site, instead of passing a Boolean to a property show alert or show sheet, you just do, it's error.presence. Okay, now I get it. It's because you have you already have in the code a property which is an optional error, and so from that optional error is going to derive a binding to a Boolean, and using the mapping that nil means false, so means don't show, and the presence means you should show. Okay, so this is really smart, and actually this is so smart that since when the article was written, SwiftUI now has a built-in support for this. It used to be that in SwiftUI you had to pass a binding to a Boolean to show an alert or a sheet, but now you can also pass a binding to an optional. So actually, this one, the number 8, I think that as of today in 2024, you don't need it anymore because there is a built-in support for it. But what's nice is that at least this example, it shows us that the built-in support in SwiftUI is not magic. It's not like some kind of SwiftUI Blackmagic, it just uses this approach of saying, okay, there is a boolean, there is an optional, and an optional actually allows you to register two states, either the absence of something or the presence of something, and so you can map it to a boolean by saying that absence is false and presence is true. And in a way, when you do that, you kind of like you disregard the actual value being stored and you just look for, is there nil or is there some value? So that's a very smart one. Number 9, reading a view's size without affecting its layout. So this seems to be a SwiftUI tip. So Ronnie is saying that he finds himself using the tip for another developer with Twitter handle at ZNTFDR, read size in all of his SwiftUI project. It's extremely useful and doesn't mess with a view's layout the way Geometry Reader does. So this one seems interesting because it's true that when you introduce a Geometry Reader in your view hierarchy, it can have an impact on how your UI is laid out. I've had cases where, for instance, I had to move some modifiers either from inside the Geometry Reader to outside from it or the other way around. I don't remember fully, but it's true that there can be this like side effect. So it seems there is a full guide available, but there is an example of using a read size. And so the idea is that you want to read the size of a view, and so you store it inside a property. Okay, we can have a look at the full guide. I'm going to guess that the way that it works is that probably, so I see a question, how does it work if not using Geometry Reader? My guess, and we'll see if I'm right, but I guess that it uses either the overlay or the background modifier to put a Geometry Reader either as an overlay or as a background, because the modifiers overlay and background, they keep the size of the view that they are attached to. So I'm pretty sure that this is how it works, but now I'm excited to see if it's actually the case. Okay, so if it's the 5 stars blog, and I think I've already read it. So, okay. Oh, okay, so it's 5 stars. So, yes, so I think this person was Federico Zanetolo, which I have met a few years ago. I think it was in Singapore in 2020. Okay, so I see exactly who it is. And so, yes, it's the background modifier on which you put a Geometry Reader. And of course, I knew it because I showed this example in the training course on SwiftUI that I gave, and that is also available on my YouTube channel. And I learned this trick on this website. So like circle of life, basically. So, okay, now it all makes sense. And I confirm it's a great trick. One thing to notice is that as with everything in computer science, it's always a trade-off, is that you are trading the fact that you don't directly use a Geometry Reader with the fact that you need to create a new property to store the size. So this might not scale as well as a Geometry Reader does. And Amir, you're saying, does it always work or is it shaky? Honestly, when I used it, I don't remember seeing issues about it. Because in a way, it's the exact same thing that if you were using the background modifier to display like a gradient, you would expect it to work like consistently. So I would expect it to work consistently. I don't recall using it and it not working. I'm also going to add this to my reading list because I want to share this tip with my colleagues. It can come in handy. Okay, so definitely a great tip, this one. Number 10, navigation bar large title gradients. So we can see here we have a large title and a gradient has been applied to it. So to add a gradient to your navigation bar large title, like the image above, you create a CA gradient layer from a color array. You convert the layer to an image. You create a UI color from the image via UI color.init pattern image, and then you set the scroll edge appearance large title text attributes. So a SwiftUI method in order to be able to set a gradient over a large title. What's interesting is that since this article is from 3 years ago, I'm not guaranteeing that this still works in the current version of SwiftUI, or that SwiftUI hasn't introduced a proper API to do this. But if one of your designers ever asks you to do this kind of design, now you know that it can be done. And the way it's done is kind of nice because it leverages several frameworks. It uses first core animation, then turns it into an image, then creates a UI color from an image, and finally set the UI color. So it shows you like the power of Apple's framework when you can use them together. And I would say, I mean, it's just a guess because I've never worked at Apple, but I guess it's one of the unfair advantage of Apple engineer is that it's easier for them to piece these things together because they have access to the people that actually implemented these frameworks. So I guess when designing Apple apps, in addition to having access to private APIs, but the fact that you have access to people who actually design the APIs, the original APIs, might be quite a help. Number 11, break combine reference cycles. So a tip about combine. So combine's assign to on method captures the on parameter strongly, potentially creating reference cycles. It's quite a caveat of combine when it was released. Combine kind of mitigated this then by introducing the assign to, but instead of passing assign to a proper key path on an object, you can do assign to, and you basically pass a publisher. So this can be a way to mitigate this. But here, I guess it's another approach. So he says that one way to do it is to use weak self inside a sync to avoid the cycle, but you can also do weak assign and weak sync. So extension on publisher where failure is never, which is already a requirement in order to use the assign method. So the publisher must not be able to error out because when you assign the result, then there needs to be no error because what do you do of the error in that case? And so weak assign, you can see that it's basically doing a sync under the hood and taking a weak reference to the object, and same thing for weak sync. So that's quite interesting because it shows you once again that extending Apple's framework using Swift is quite easy and often actually easier than what you would expect, especially since like here we're using Combine, which if you've never looked at Combine, it's quite a complex framework. It uses a lot of generics. It has quite an intricate hierarchy of protocol and classes. Yet, if you have just used Combine a few times, I think you should be able to write this code because it's extending publisher, which is the API you already use, and it's using a sync, which is an API you already use, and it uses the concept of capturing a weak reference, which you are probably already familiar with. So I think this shows that it's one of the qualities of Combine that you can still extend it without having to deep dive into all of its complexities. And if you've never used Combine, but you're still curious to learn a tiny bit about it, I have a series of 2 live streams on my channel that go exactly over this topic, trying to give you an idea of what Combine is, how it works in a few hours, not going too deep, but also not staying too shallow. This way, if you ever need to work with a code base that is on Combine, you already know where to start. But let's stop here with the auto promo and move on to tip number 12, using the Accessibility Inspector, a great tool that was introduced a long time ago. I think it was introduced, I first used it in 2016. So it's not new, but it was not also there since the beginning. So maybe why it's not that well known, but you can audit your app through the Accessibility Inspector, which you get in Xcode. So Xcode menu, open developer tool, Accessibility Inspector, and it allows you to basically raise potential accessibility issues like the text being not inaccessible or a hit area being too small, meaning that it's going to be very hard to just precisely tap on the button. So this can be very useful, especially since in projects accessibility tend to not be considered as a first priority, which is a shame, but it's also something that tends to happen. So if you're ever asked to make sure that an app is accessible, know that you have this tool, which is extremely helpful. It can make you save a lot of time. Moving on to tip number 13, rounded text design. So I guess here we have text and we want to round the end of each word. And so to give your text a friendlier, more fun vibe, you can use a rounded design instead of the default one. So this will use SF Pro rounded under the hood, so it uses a different font, and you can get this by doing font, system, large title, and providing the argument design, which must have a default value, but this time you provide an explicit value, which will be rounded. So I've never used this before, but if you are prototyping a new app and you are relying on all of the design system from Apple, so by that I mean the SF fonts, SF symbols for the icons, etc., it's a way to give a little bit more of a friendlier vibe, because it's true that when you compare the two, the first one looks very like official, not newspaper-like because it's still a sans serif font, but the first one looks like it could be like the app of your bank. The second one is more like your friendly neighborhood app. You get the idea. So a good one to know. So number 14 is actually the one that I read when I was checking out the article before the live stream. So uses auto layout property wrapper, and it's a nice one because it kind of ties into the live stream I did last time about what is the property translates auto resizing mask into constraints about. So using auto layout and occasionally forget to call translates auto resizing mask into constraints equal false. That happened to me in the past, and we've all been there. Instead, you can use a uses auto layout property wrapper that automatically makes the call for you. I see a question in the live. Do we have a replay for this live? Yes, as usual, as soon as the live is over, there will be a replay available immediately using the same link, so you will be able to catch the beginning of the live. Don't worry. Another comment that says, the sad thing is that Apple doesn't provide a default way to give a rounded design on navigation titles in SwiftUI. That's a good one. That's a good one. Let me just scroll back to one of the other tips. Look, here in this other tip, it was rounded, and it seemed to also use the Apple's API. So I don't know how this was created. So if you want to know how it was done, I would say, Mattia, your best guess is to go on Ronnie's blog using the URL in the description, find his Twitter account, and ask him on Twitter how he did it. But I guess he managed to do it somehow. So best way to know how is to ask him. That's a great point. So let's go back to this property wrapper uses auto layout. So basic property wrapper, you define a struct, annotate it with property wrapper, and you can see that in the init, what it does is that it calls this method set translates auto resizing mask into constraints, and this method is going to set the property as false. And it does it either when the value is initialized the first time or when a new view is set to the property wrapper. And so in code, you will only need to annotate your property with uses auto layout, and then you can just set a value to it, and you won't need to remember to call this line. So setting translates auto resizing mask into constraints to false. So this approach, I think it's a great approach, but I will add one warning is that if you use this, use it everywhere. But please don't use it only in specific files or only like one time you use it, one time you don't. Use it either everywhere that you write UI code programmatically or never use it. But never do this kind of approaches halfway, because otherwise it's going to become really, really confusing both for you, but also for people that will join your code base. So be very strict about whether you use it or not. Do it all the way. And I would even say if you use it, maybe look if you can set like some kind of linter rule to give you an error when you don't use the property wrapper on programmatic UI. It should be like either, if you use it, it should be either you have uses auto layout or you have IB outlet, but it shouldn't be neither. Otherwise, it should be an error. So I would go that far. So, but at least like don't use it one day and not the other. Like make a choice and stick to it. And it means that if you use it in a code base, like if you have a code base who is already like a few years old with a lot of code, think twice about introducing this kind of property wrapper if you don't plan on refactoring the rest of the code, because once again, it can be confusing. I'm not saying don't do it, but I'm saying like think the pros and the cons thoughtfully. Number 15, we're getting close to halfway of the list. Rounded rectangle corners. you want a rounded rectangle with a corner radius only applied to some corners, use this extension on view. So the goal is to be able to round only these two corners, so top left and top right, or rather top leading and top trailing. And so we have this struct, rounded corner rectangle, which is a shape. So this is SwiftUI code. We have the radius and the corner. And for the path, you can see that it's getting, so the corner radii, okay. And then a Bezier path. And here it passes which corners you want to round. So the idea is that we don't see the call site, but UI or rect corner. Let me try and get the documentation from it. I'm gonna go on Google and look for it. So it's a struct with static members, and so you have top left, top right, bottom left, bottom right, and all corners. So I guess it's what's called an option set. Yes, it's an option set. So it allows you to specify which corner you want to round, and you have this nice little code which is going to expose a function that you can call on a view to set a corner radius with that will only apply to some specific corners. It would be interesting to see if since 2021 there is now an API, a built-in API into SwiftUI for this. I'm not sure actually. I have used corner radius in SwiftUI, but I don't think I've used it only for some specific corners recently. So I'm not sure if there is a first-party support, but you can see that you can introduce it by adding this little extension on view and with the underlying shape that makes it work. And basically, this is just some glue for existing code. You can see that if you didn't have the fact that you can create a Bezier path by specifying corners, the code that you need to write would be way longer. Okay, moving on to tip 16. libdispatch target queues. Have you used libdispatch target queues before? Coupled with resume suspend, it makes it super easy to pause work and resume it later. libdispatch handles it all for you. Can you guess what happens in this example? So this is code that uses Grand Central Dispatch. So we have a notification queue. We suspend it. Then asyncly, we run some code that says, okay, are we on the notification queue? Are we on the main queue? Okay. Then more async code, and then resume what's going to be printed. And it doesn't say what's going to happen. So I guess I just have to create a project in Xcode and try it. So I'm gonna open Xcode. Xcode is loading. Before the live, I was like, should I create a project? And then I was like, no, I don't think we're going to need to. But actually, yes, we do. So creating a new project. I'm doing it on my other screen. That's why you don't see it. I'm gonna make it a macOS command line tool. This way it will go faster. And I won't need to spawn a simulator or anything. All right. Let me put the window of Xcode, put it at the right side so that you can see what I do. Perfect. Okay. Let's paste the code. All right. So we have the code. So what is going to be printed? I would assume that, are they going to be executed in order? This one is the dispatch queue main. What's going to happen? Because it's a dispatch queue that targets the main also. What does it mean, target? I've never used it. Target, it means that the target queue on which to execute blocks specify, okay, so actually, this is more like an alias to the main queue. So I guess this is not going to do anything. Like this will block the main queue, and then it's going to be like over. It's interesting because it could be either that this blocks the main queue because it's just an alias, and then the code is blocked forever, or that's not the case, and then the code will still run. Let's see. So it's building. Program ended with exit code 0. So nothing was printed to the console. Let's just see. If I remove the call to suspend, Okay, yes, here it called resume, but there was nothing that that was suspended. Oh, but I think because the program reaches the end, it doesn't have time. I think it's because, yeah, I think I made a mistake. I shouldn't have put the code into a command line tool because it's going to exit. It's going to exit before. So I made a mistake. I'm gonna create a new project. This time it's going to be an iOS project. My bad. Should have done it like that since the beginning. I'm not trying a playground because playground they tend to crash when you do them during a live stream. So I'm not going to try my luck that far. Let's see. I'm putting this here. All right. Perfect. So Swift UI, we don't care about Swift UI. I'm going to create a new file. I'm gonna call it code. Okay, I'm gonna create a function which I call code. I'm gonna paste my code inside of it, and just when my app is launched on app here, I'm going to call the function code. So we have an entry point for this, and so now I can run. We need to spawn a simulator, so it's going to take, you can see the simulator right here. I'm gonna put it in the other screen because we won't need it. We are only interested in the console. Yeah, let's see what's gonna happen this time. Okay, so it's a good thing I switched to iOS. So we can see we have this code being run, then it runs this code, and then this code. So this is interesting because it means that even though this dispatch queue here only looks like an alias on the main queue, actually, when you suspend notification queue, you don't suspend the target queue. So it's a way to create like a pointer, for lack of a better word, to another queue. But when you suspend, you only suspend the pointer and not the actual queue. So it makes sense to be able to create this kind of like it's kind of like having a view on a queue in a way, or having a proxy on a queue. You only suspend the proxy, and so this everything that was scheduled on notification queue has to wait for resume to run, but the main queue can still running. And actually, if it had suspended the main queue, the app would have stopped there because there would have been no way to restart the main queue since it had been suspended forever. So that was an interesting one. I'm not gonna lie, I've never used these two primitives, suspend and resume, before, but also I've never written a lot of code that uses the one central dispatch. So that might be why, but it's good to know that these primitives do exist. I see a message from Mattia regarding the previous code, so I'm going to show it as I read it. So, won't corner radius be deprecated in future versions of Swift? Now, Apple suggests to use clip shape, and from there, I think you can choose which corner you want to round up using a rounded rectangle. In that case, yes. And in a way, you could completely you could keep this API, so this extension to view, and you could rework how it's under the hood, but it's like clip shape. So here it's clip shape, clip shape. And I guess where you are very right is that this rounded corners rectangle, I think maybe now there is a version of it in SwiftUI. You know what? Let's search for it. SwiftUI rounded rectangle. Rounded rectangle right here. So we have one that takes the corner radius, and then there is the rounded. Oh, uneven rounded rectangle. I didn't know about. Oh yes, it's here. Okay, and then you can pass in different values for each of the corners, and we can even see an interesting added value is that before with the previous API we had top left and top right, and here we have top trailing and top leading. So this might even be more. This might work better with right to left languages than the previous API. So it seems it's a superior API. So thank you for making this remark because I wouldn't have thought about it. Okay, we were here. 17. Avoiding code repetition. So quite a good goal. It's supposed to be the DRY principle, dry for don't repeat yourself. So let's see what's the example here. So here's a list of small examples that could help make your Swift code cleaner and avoid repetition. Did you know all of them? So you have a reference to a UI view controller, and instead of doing if my view controller is a UI collection view controller, else if my view controller is a UI table view controller, etc., you can do a switch and do case is. Oh, that's nice. I guess I knew that you could do is in a switch, but not that you could do it while switching over a reference type. So it's really nice. You might be wondering who would want to write this kind of code, because this looks like a code smell. As it turns out, this kind of code is quite useful if you ever need to traverse the view hierarchy of a UIKit app, and you need to do, well, if it's a tab bar, then I want to look at the selected view controller. If it's a navigation controller, then I want to look at the visible view controller. If it's a presenting view controller, I want to look at the presented. This kind of approach where you either want to drill down to the current view, or you want to go up to the parent view. There are many cases where you need to do this kind of traversals, and so it's nice to know that you can also implement them using a switch. And what's nice in this case is that you only mention the identifier myViewController once, whereas in the other case you had to mention it in every single if or else if clause. Then here, instead of enum and then cases on every line, you can do case once and then do comma separated values. It depends really like on the style. I must say I've always done this one, but I guess it really depends on the style here. It's more of a question of a style. And I see a good remark, which is that in the example above, usually you want to cast it, not only check type it. It's true that usually you will then want to access a given property following the typecast, so you are more likely to do an if let. Indeed, that's a good point. You are more likely to do an if let than just a case is, because then you will just, I mean, if you do this and then you end up doing like as exclamation mark inside the case, well, it's a little bit like you jumped forward and then you jump backward. So it's even worse. Like it's like you jumped forward a little and then you jump backwards a lot. I'm not sure it's the right way to say it in English, but you get what I mean. Third example, so you have an enum state with two cases, some of them having associated values, okay? And so instead of switching on the state to print, what you can do is that, oh yes, when you have several different cases that have the same type for an associated value, you can put the two cases together, use the same identifier to bind the associated value, and then use it with this kind of unified identifier that will refer to either, so this value here will refer to either this value or that value. And since both cases are mutually exclusive and both associated values have the same type, it's okay to have this factorization. This one is a very smart one. And next one, instead of switching over an authorization status and doing several actions, what you can do is that, okay, so it's the create error that is both in denied and in default. You can do a fall through. That's indeed, yes, a good one. You could also create a function that you would call in both cases. I know that there are some, I think even Swiftlint by default might give you a warning if you use a fall through. You want to be careful because fall through, I think it only falls to the next one. So if you have several cases and you want them to fall through one after the other, you need to use a fall through in every case. Even though Swift will give you an error if you put an empty case, so it's not likely to happen, but it's still good to know. But it's true that yeah, fall through, it's you can use it in Swift. It's not super popular, but it's still usable. So a good example for it. Tip number 18, centering views in SwiftUI. I use a simple extension on View to center my views horizontally or vertically. So you can see, it's an interesting one because it uses spacer. So it puts one spacer before and one after. What's interesting is that there is another approach to do this, which is to use the frame modifier and give either a height or a width of, maybe it's more a max height or a max width of infinity. And then you have another argument to specify the position, and you can say center. So using spacer is one way to do it. Using the frame modifier is another way to do it. What's nice is that you definitely don't want to put these H tag and V tags with spacer at the beginning and the end. You don't want to sprinkle this code all over your code base. So having this center modifier, I would say it's a nice approach. But if you don't want to define something custom, you can use the frame modifier with this trick of putting infinite width or infinite height and center position. But it's a good one. It's a good one. Number 19, hiding SwiftUI view labels. At first, I found it weird that some SwiftUI views required a label or a title, for instance, picker, progress view, color picker, etc. If you don't want the label to be visible, don't use empty view, but instead use the labels hidden view modifier. So apparently, you can call this modifier, which will make the label hidden. But I guess the advantage of using labels hidden rather than passing an empty view is that this string here is probably still can still be used for accessibility. I guess that's the reason why it's a better approach. Let's confirm it by checking what the doc says for this modifier. So use this modifier when you want to omit a label. All right. Okay, so it removes it. But you can see, always provide a label for controls, even when you hide the label, because SwiftUI uses labels for other purposes, including accessibility. And you could also say it makes your code more future-proof, because maybe that for some controls, there are some controls where showing a label doesn't make sense on iOS, but maybe in VisionOS, for instance, having the label somewhere in the code can make it can make your app work better. I have no idea if it's actually the case, but the idea is that the more info you give to SwiftUI, the more SwiftUI will be able to make the right choice, and you can tell it, okay, don't display the label, but if you ever need to use it for some other thing, you can still rely on it. Tip number 20, group box. You don't need to think about corner radius and background color every time. SwiftUI does it for you. So you can use a group box and you give it some content. You give it a label. So here, a system image, and then it will put, we could say, the correct background color depending on whether you are using light mode or dark mode. So that's interesting. Let's see what the doc has to say about this. So it's this one in Swift. I've never used it. I think I've never used it. A stylized view with an option label that visually collects a logical grouping of content. So something like this. So it's true that we see this pattern a lot in Apple's app. So that's good to know if your designer likes to take a lot of inspiration from the Apple design system. And I would say it's also a good thing to use if you ever you're working on a new app and you're relying on Apple's design resources to do the design. It's a great way to be able to group content, to group UI elements together without having to spend too much effort on how to do it. So it's very nice, and what's nice is that we can imagine that it's going to set the correct padding and everything for you. So it's a pretty good one. And I see Tom is saying in the chat that he has a product owner who likes the default UI design. So in that case, it's a really good one. Tip number 21. So we're getting to the last 10 tips. Free trial text. If your app offers a free trial, make sure to dynamically check the user's eligibility status before displaying, for instance, 7-day free trial. The user might have already consumed their introductory price, so use the trial and then cancelled. If you're using RevenueCat, it's very easy to check. Just pass your product IDs to purchases.checkTrial or introductory price eligibility. So I was about to say, I've never implemented in-app label myself. In-app label. Someone said label in the chat. In-app purchase myself using StoreKit. I always use RevenueCat, so I was about to say you should use RevenueCat. So he said it before, use Revenue Cat if you use in-app purchases. It's way simpler. And they did not sponsor this live stream, by the way. Someone is saying, what is this label right here? Label is very confusing in SwiftUI because in SwiftUI, label can mean two things. It can be the name of an argument, which often means passing whatever view you want to display. But label is also a type in SwiftUI, which was introduced with iOS 14, if memory serves me well. Yeah, I'm gonna have to say SwiftUI, otherwise it's way too common of a word. So label, iOS 14, and it's the combination of an icon and a label, but a label in the sense of a string. And the idea is that when you use it, there are no examples, but when you use it, basically it's gonna be a label and a string and an icon, and SwiftUI will display it in a way that makes sense. So here, for instance, this little icon and this string here is represented by this label. So if you've never used it, it can be quite useful. I would say use it if you are relying on the Apple UI design system. If you're not, it might be a bit of a foot gun because you're going to maybe spend a lot of time tweaking the result when you would have been better just using an HStack or a VStack. But if you use the Apple way of designing, it can be a nice thing to know. Tom, you're saying, for instance, SwiftUI button has a label. So let's have a look at this. So let's have a look at the button in SwiftUI. Because it might be a bit, yes, but you see, that's why I was saying it's confusing. Because here, it's so confusing because we have label, which is a view in SwiftUI which represents an icon and the text. And then here we have label, which is a generic argument, which can be actually any kind of view. It could be anything. You can put whatever you want inside the button. You can put an image. You can put a progress view if you want. I guess you can put whatever you want. So the use of the word label in SwiftUI is extremely confusing because it can mean so many different things at the same time. If you have ever done C, maybe you know that in C, static is a keyword that can mean, I think, either that can have either 3 or 4 different meanings depending on where it's used and what it's applied to. Label is the kind of the same thing in SwiftUI. This is very, very, very confusing. I think I will do this gives you an idea for a newsletter in the future about what's a label in SwiftUI and try to go over all of the different ways that SwiftUI uses this term. You know what? I'm gonna make a screenshot of this so that I do a kind of like a mental note, but more like let's leave a screenshot on my desktop kind of note. Okay. And also one reason why you want to check this, because if you say you offer a free trial but it's not available in reality, you might get into trouble with Apple regarding the compliance of your paywall. So be careful about it. Okay, tip 22, optionals and unsafely unwrapped. If you have var myvar of type optional int, did you know that myvar ? And myvar.unsafely unwrapped don't behave the same way? So first, I have never used this unsafely unwrapped, so I want to know what it does now. Unsafely unwrapped trades safety for performance. So in a debug build, similar behavior, but in optimized build, undefined behavior if the value is nil. So I guess what this says under the hood is do not use unsafely unwrapped unless you are absolutely sure of what you are doing, which is probably never the case. I wouldn't see any reason to use unsafely unwrapped unless if you are writing some extremely some code that needs to have some extreme performance. But I would say unless you're writing the Swift standard library, don't use unsafely unwrapped. And in general, don't use any API that has the unsafe word in it, because it basically means if you've made a mistake in your code, you're on your own, and your app won't even have the decency to crash. It will keep running, but potentially in a bad and corrupted state. You will not get a crash report. So really, don't use these things unless you have to and you know what you're doing. And the combination of the two things is almost never the case. So be very careful about this one, and it's good to know that this is not the same thing. Number 23, doubling your app's keyword. So I guess we are back on App Store optimization tips. So you can 2x your app's keyword from 100 to 200 characters on App Store Connect by utilizing unused localization. For example, a US App Store search uses both the EN US and the ES Mexican localizations. So you can add extra English keywords to ESMX if your app isn't localized for it. So that's quite a smart one. I guess it can be really worth it when you are starting a new app and you haven't localized it into many countries and you want to like maximize the chances of it being discovered in the one local that you are implementing, which is, I guess, more likely to be English. So that's a good one to know. That's a good one to know. Very indie hacker dev. Tip 24, calling view layout if needed in animation blocks. Instead of calling view layout if needed on your animated views in an animation block, you can use the layout subviews animation option. So UIKit will take care of laying out the views you animate. So here in this case, we do UI view animate and we call layout if needed explicitly, but you can also just pass the option layout subviews in order to say, okay, you want to trigger a layout of the view. So that's a good one. I didn't know about this one, but it's good to know that it does exist. To be honest, the real problem is not to call either this or that. It's to remember that you need to do it, because you very easily end up like writing some animation code and then it's not working as you would like it to. Just like when you forgot to set translates auto-resizing mask into constraints to false. You don't understand what's happening and then you're like, oh yes, maybe I should try to call this one. Often you also try to call view settings layout just to see what's going to happen, and you try to brute force it by trying every combination. We've all been there. But it's good to know that you can pass in this option and be done with it. Number 25, importing individual symbols. Instead of importing a whole module, you can import individual structs, classes, enums, functions, variables, and more. It helps reduce the API surface your Swift file is exposed to. So that's an interesting one. It's especially interesting to me because a few days ago I was writing a bit of TypeScript code for another project I work on at work, and in TypeScript you do import like this, but it's more and more the way to do it. Like, you don't import a whole module, you only import the types or the functions or the methods that you want to import. So it's good to know that this also exists in Swift. You don't use it every day. You might remember a case situation where you had to use it. If it's because it was in the case where you know that the decodable framework was introduced with Swift 4, but before that, there was no built-in decodable framework, but there was a very popular third-party framework which was also called decodable. And so this was causing an issue, and a way to solve this was to say, okay, I don't want to import decodable, but I just want to import this specific class from the framework decodable. And so this way you would solve the conflict. So if you were in the case like me of having to deal with this situation, something like, I don't know, like 6 or 5 years ago, something like that, maybe you remember having to do import protocol, I think it was import protocol decodable or something like this. Number 26, UI graphics image renderer performance. Using UI graphics image renderer, performance tip, keep a reference to your renderer to reuse it. The renderer keeps a cache of core graphics context, so reusing the same renderer can be more efficient than creating new renderers. Why is this thing for? Is it if you want to turn like a view into a PNG? Let's see, I'm not sure. So it's for creating core graphics backed images. So you can use renderers to accomplish drawing tasks. Oh, okay, so if when you want to draw something on the screen. Okay. Oh, okay, yes, and then you can do like you get a context in which you can draw, so just like a canvas. Okay, I remember using this, but with the old API where you had to call a function that was like something like UI graphics image render context start and context end. So it's a good to know that you can keep a reference to the renderer, kind of like a formatter in a way. when you think about it, because formatters, they are expensive to initialize the first time you use them. So it's also a good thing to keep a reference to them. And you're saying, Tom, that you use this to draw a 2D plan from a 3D scan. Yeah, that's a great use case. I'm not sure that we use it a lot in the Photoroom app. We use rather Metal for all of these things, but it's the same kind of idea, like being able to draw with 2D primitives. And you're saying UI graphics context is deprecated. So I guess it's the old API that I was referring to. Let's see if I can get it here. UI graphics context. I'm gonna try and Google it. Graphics context. So was it the one I was referring to? So this one is iOS 15. It's quite recent. And you're saying it's deprecated, this one? I'm just having a look. I'm not very familiar with these APIs. And yeah, you're saying image manipulation in Metal is supposed to be faster. I mean, at least that's what Apple keeps telling us. Every time, every WWDC. Even though it might be, I was about to say it's harder to set up a Metal pipeline than it is to use the UI graphic stuff. However, SwiftUI has introduced some nice way to easily, less difficultly call Metal shaders from SwiftUI. So it's slightly simpler. Okay, we're getting close to the end. Tip number 27. Diagnosing slow SwiftUI build times. So if you add X frontend warn long function bodies 100 and X frontend warn long expression type checking 100 to your other Swift flags, so in your build settings, it's going to give you a warning whenever either the body of a function or an expression take more than 100 milliseconds to compile or to type check. So this can be quite useful if you find out that your project is long to build and you want to understand which are the parts where you should put some efforts into optimizing, because you don't want to go like left and right and optimize blindly. They say that you can only optimize what you are measuring. That might not always be true, but that might be true in a lot of instances. And so in that case, having this that will tell you first where to optimize, but also that will give you a warning if the performance degrades in the future is very useful. I might have used something like this in the past. I'm thinking typically like when Swift 3 was introduced back in 2016, many projects started to see like some very slow compile time, mostly because the type checker had become slower to compile expressions that used to evaluate faster in the past. So that used to be very useful. What about using tools like Bazel for build? I'm sorry, I'm not the right person to talk about this because I have never used a third-party build system. I've always worked with projects that were still small enough that they could rely on Xcode. So I'm not the right person to tell you about it. Sorry about that. Let me take a look at the messages. So you're saying this is deprecated, so frame width UI screen main bounds width because it's deprecated too. UI screen main bounds, yes, it's deprecated. I don't know what's the correct way to fix it, to be honest. I'm sure I had to deal with it at one point on Photoroom, or either my colleagues did, but I remember. Actually, I'm not sure, because I remember seeing some warnings in the project about using UI screen, and I think there were maybe like 1 or 2 times where we were like, but what's the alternative? So actually, I'm not sure that we found it, honestly. I have no memory of the alternative, so maybe we were like, okay, but we don't have an equivalent API, so we'll see what we're going to do. I agree that you shouldn't use a UI screen anyway, as you're saying, Amir, because, for instance, if you are running in split view in an iPad, it's not the best. Or yeah, I guess on Vision Pro it's even worse. That being said, it gives you an incentive to solve the issue if you want your app to run on Vision Pro. But yeah, to be honest, like that, top of my mind, I don't have an idea on how to solve this kind of code. I would just say you need to find a way to know what is the size at the topmost level. So this might involve, I would say, if you are in UIKit world, I mean, if you're using, oh yes, UI screen, you're using it in SwiftUI, but I mean, your app is running in UIKit at the top level anyway. You could do it by getting like the UI window. I would guess if you get the UI window and it's root view controller and you get the size of the root view controller of the UI window, I would say it's the cleanest way to do it. Yeah, I see what you're suggesting, Tom. Is kind of like in the same idea. That's what I was suggesting. But I was thinking, in the past, like a year or 2 years, every time I had to write some code that would operate somehow at the top level of the hierarchy, I would tend to do an extension on UI window. So that's why I would go in that direction. So I would say look towards UI window because it's supposed to have the right size. And indeed, UI screen is becoming less and less a good one, especially as we have more and more split screen, picture-in-picture, and these kind of nice features that also break some older APIs, or rather that break some incorrect usage of older APIs. All right, tip 28, only 3 to go, sorting by name in Xcode. Did you know that you can sort your files group by name in Xcode? I was manually sorting them before learning that, so you can do right-click, sort by name. You know what? Let's try it. It's amazing. I didn't know it was possible. I know that back in the days when Xcode projects would really give you some really bad Git conflicts, there was a command line tool to try and minimize the conflicts that would apply some kind of sorting. This way, it will reduce the amount of potential conflicts because everyone would sort the same way when saving to the project file. But I didn't know you could do that. You know, like you learn something new every day. And what's amazing is that the option has been straight in our face for years, and we might have never seen it. Very good point from Amir. They are automatically sorted in some directory. Yes, I think it's when you are using Swift packages. Since Swift packages, they don't rely on an Xcode proj file. There is no place to store an actual order, and so they handle the order by implementing some sorting by default, and you cannot opt out. Yes, SPM, you were saying it just after in the chat. Okay, tip 29. Never fill an encryption form ever again on App Store Connect. So you can set ITS, so for iTunes Store, because I think the App Store still uses the iTunes Store under the hood, uses non-exempt encryption to know in your info playlist, after which App Store Connect won't ask you to fill the encryption exemption form ever again. That is, if your usage is exempt, of course, for instance, using HTTPS. So if you never had to submit an app to App Store Connect, you might not know this, but the first time you submit it, you are asked to basically say that your app doesn't contain any kind of encryption that is like that requires an export license in the sense of exporting technologies outside the boundaries of your country. So it can be a bit stressful the first time that you see it, and you can disable it by setting this value to know inside your playlist, but only do it, of course, if you are exempt from it. And I'm not a lawyer, so don't take my word for it, but the gist of it is that if you only use standard encryptions like HTTPS or using the secure enclave using the keychain, you should be exempt from it. But remember, I'm not a lawyer, so don't take my advice for it. Last tip, pre-processing info.playlist. Did you know that you could add a preprocessor directive to your info playlist? Useful when maintaining many schemes for the same target. You can set preprocess info playlist file to yes in your Xcode project, and then you can set info playlist preprocessor definition. Okay, so this is. Oh, okay. So you set preprocess info playlist file to yes. And then you can set the preprocessor definition. So it's kind of like the constants that you will be able to use. And then you can do a pound if inside the playlist, even though it's an XML file. So you can add a bit of logic to your XML file. You can only do like conditional compilation, so you cannot run arbitrary code, but it's still like better than nothing. And I know that there are alternate options where you can only like you can have an Xcode build file that will set only the value that you want to change, but it's an interesting alternative if it makes sense for you. And that's it. Ronnie is hoping that we've learned something new reading this post. So let me go back to full cam. So I can tell you that I have learned something new, more than one new thing doing this live stream. So I definitely think that you must have also learned a few new things. It was a really interesting live stream. I know that I will definitely like do a newsletter email, just a recap of this live stream, but also it gives me idea for other topics that I could dig deeper. So once again, a big thank you to Ronnie for writing this article and allowing me to cover it in this live stream. Thanks a lot for all of the messages in the chat. It was really nice to have all of this interaction. Doing a live stream for the first time on a Monday, and not even on a WWDC week, I was worried that maybe on a Monday there wouldn't be that many people, but I'm glad to see that there were many people and there was a lot of energy and of comments and questions, and that was really great. Now the live will be available as a replay. I will do the work of adding like the 30 chapters for all of the tips, because it will make it so much easier to navigate if you want to see another part again. I see a comment, would love to see video on Apple OpenAPI generator framework. It would be very interesting, because I've been using something similar to this, but in TypeScript for something unrelated to iOS. But that would be a good one. Let me do a screenshot of your comment. I see another question. Vincent, have you tried KMP native UI? Is it Kotlin multi-platform? I guess it is. I've never used it. I read about it a bit a few years ago, but back then it was, I think it was less like powerful than it is today, because back then it was still using actually Objective-C. It was still building to Objective-C and not Swift itself, which caused some issues. For instance, like when you were switching over an enum, the switch was not could not check for exhaustivity. I've heard that it improved a lot, but to be honest, I've never used it at Photoroom. Both apps are running. They are either like a full native iOS or Android. So I've never had the opportunity to use it. I know people who use it and who are quite happy with it. So KMP still uses Objective-C bridging. Okay, that's good to know. Personally, it's not that I'm not a big fan of these frameworks. I mean, yes, I'm not a big fan of these frameworks, but if you use this kind of frameworks, be aware that there will be a hype cycle. At some point, there will be less hype, they will be less popular, and their maintainer will have less of an incentive to maintain them. Apple will always maintain their developer platform as long as they are selling devices, and they seem to be doing pretty well at selling devices. So like iOS is not going away in the coming years. Think about React Native. It used to be very popular. It seems to be less popular now. Same thing with Flutter. I'm old enough to remember when Cordoba, Mobile Gap, Ionic were introduced. They were all like very popular. People were using them a lot. Some kind of business, typically like agencies, were trying to use them a lot because it meant cheaper cost to develop an app, and so more likely to win more projects or to pay less and so make more money. But the problem is that, as someone is saying in the chat, write once, debug everywhere. You will not save half the development cost. You will save 20 to 30% at best, but you will still need to test on both platforms and solve issues on both platforms. And also, once the framework that you're using will be less popular, it will be a big problem. If a new feature comes up that could be really useful for your business, but your framework doesn't support it, that's also a big problem. So you really want to be careful about it. Personally, I'm not a big fan of it. Every time I've used them, it wasn't great. I would say it makes sense. For me, it makes sense for like throwaway apps. Like you're an agency doing apps for events that and then once the event is over, the app has no value. yes, use this approach. It might make sense. But if you're like a company like Photoroom who is trying to build an app that will evolve over time, that will be integrating the latest technical possibilities of their respective platforms, so iOS and Android, and basically the app you're building is the product that will make your company successful or not, then in that case, of course, that you want to invest on native technologies because it's really rare. It's really hard to build an outstanding app using this kind of hybrid frameworks. I guess that's kind of like my issue with them. You can build a lot of okay-ish app, and there are many situations in life where, from a business point of view, it's okay to have an okay-ish app. Like when you go to like an event and you have an app, you don't expect it to be wonderful. You just want it not to crash, to be reliable. But if you want to make an app that people will like use every day and will enjoy using, then having like a native approach will probably be better. It's kind of a question of like, in a way, is your audience captive or not? Like you're a bank, your customers have to use your app. There is a very low likelihood that users will choose their main bank because of the app. At least in France, they will choose their main bank because the main bank gave them a mortgage with a good rate. So in that case, the audience is a captive audience. So you might get away with using an approach that gives you an okay-ish app, but if you need to convince your audience to use your app, you need to delight your audience with the experience that your app delivers, then in that case, using native is probably a better approach. And you have many apps that, for instance, they start only on iOS. This way, they focus only on one platform. iOS is supposedly easier to monetize early than Android. And then once they have reached a stage where they can afford to work on 2 native platforms, then they develop a native Android app along the way. That's what Photoroom did as an example. Oh wow, it's true that we have Point Free also being live today. So this is a Swift live stream Monday. That's amazing. I didn't coordinate with Point Free, but it's true that I saw that they were doing their live stream. And you're saying that's why Revolut is better than the other. That's a great example. Revolut have a great app, and people will use Revolut, but more probably as a secondary bank. They will probably need to have another bank only for the kind of the loan issue, the mortgage issue, which are much harder to get with online banks. But yes, because Revolut has a great app, it was able to convince people to use their app as a secondary app, which is no small thing because no one wakes up one morning and is like, oh, you know what? It would be really great if I installed a second banking app. No one wants that. People want to have maybe an app that is easier to use or have a credit card that works like better when you are abroad, this kind of thing. So you need to sell people on the idea of installing a second bank and having to deal with a second bank, and offering a great experience, a great native experience is a good way to do it. That was a nice off topic to finish this live stream. Okay, it's been almost 1 hour and a half. I think I will stop now. I was a bit sick this morning, but I'm glad to see that I've been able to pull it off like without feeling too sick. So I'm really glad it went well. Once again, thank you for joining. Thank you for commenting. I see that you've enjoyed this live stream, so I'm very glad I've been able to start this week with this really cool live stream. And I just have to say, well, enjoy your evening, enjoy the rest of your day, depending on where you are in the world, and see you next time. Bye bye.